Yeah! What's going on, people? This your man Big A, and this episode is all about brine. Now, I know you've heard this before, brining your meat before you actually smoke it or barbecue it. It's either or, but it's a basic way of pre-seasoning your meat. So I'm going to get into brining meat here in this episode. So take a look. Now, I know you've heard the difference between a wet brine, as you can see here with the chicken, as well as a dry brine. Now, brining is pretty simple. Excuse me there. Most people just use a salt. Now, if you're like me, you're worried about the high blood pressure. I use a low sodium type salt. Most people will say, oh, when you brine your meat, you're supposed to use a kosher salt. Well, this is just an understanding of what brining is all about. So brining, I do have a preference for a shorter cut. What I'm talking about is a less meat content. I tend to use a dry brine. But when I have these bigger cuts of meat, a whole chicken or a big whole turkey, I choose to use a wet brine. Now, a dry brine, I'd like you to think of the salt really just getting into the base of the meat. So right here, your salt, what you do is going to just kind of base the meat, right? So you might want to lightly salt it, or some people, they go pretty heavy. So it really has a preference on you as well as the health concern. Now here with the wet brine, I like you to think that the overnight of keeping it in a salted wet mixture, it's going to allow the meat to absorb and get close to the bone, right? So you want your meat seasoned all the way to the bone. Now, I have a technique for that when we get into seasoning, how to help your meat stay flavorful all the way to the bone. But this is the difference between a wet or a dry brine. One, it's just here. I do have a preference to use it on the shorter cuts of meat, the meat that has less of a thickness to it, right? And I like to use the wet brine for meats that are bigger. They have a larger meat content. So that's brining. Yeah, so like I said, you can choose to use a wet or a dry brine. Now, here's a question that I always get. They say, well, Big A, I went to the grocery store today, right? And I just bought, a whole chicken and I want to eat this chicken now. I want to smoke it. Do I have to brine it and do all these things overnight? The answer is no. Brining is just a technique that people use. Some people say the wet brine tends to keep the meat more moist, as well as the dry brine. My thing is if you're ready to eat and you're ready to cook, you could season your meat right at that time and get it up in the smoker and get it on the grill, right? And we all know this. So the next episode, we're going to talk about seasoning. I'm going to show you how I season. Again, being a novice, I'm developing my techniques. I hope that these techniques and tips will help you cook a wonderful meal. And like they say, the best thing about cooking is with a little bit of love. So my love to you. This episode is about brining. Until next time, thank you for tuning in. Click subscribe. Really help me support each other in what we do. Big A.